I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, the place to learn from thought leaders in the world of wine and marketing, welcoming you back to the Washington State Wine This Is Now series, a specially commissioned two-part series to complement the Washington State Wine Deep Dive I published in February 2021. Following on my conversation with Steve Warner, president of the Washington State Wine Commission, in episode 465, today I bring you coverage of the Washington State Wine Annual Tasting 2022. Told through the voices of winery representatives, trade attendees, and a masterclass hosted by Jamie Goode, the episode provides an in-depth snapshot of the current state of Washington wine. You can find below details of all wines I tasted with producers on the day, as well as those featured during Jamie's masterclasses. We kick things off with two conversations I had early on with representatives from two wineries present on the day, Gramercy Cellars and Mark Ryan Winery. Enjoy.
My name is Drew Mahan. I'm with Gramercy Cellars over in Walla Walla, Washington. I am the national sales manager for the winery. We're a pretty small team, only about a team of 5 people, so everybody has their hands in a little bit of something. So titles aren't really defined as such, but it gives the winery a lot of balance, and it makes talking about the wines that much easier because everybody's kind of got their hands affiliated all over the winery, so it's fun. Everybody feels a part, and you can kind of feel that passion in every single bottle. So, but we're Gramercy Cellars. We're located over in Walla Walla, Washington, small town, about 35,000 people, right on the Oregon border in the Lower East corner of the state. Originally, the owner, head winemaker Greg Harrington, got his start as a master sommelier from New York. Had a Walla Walla Syrah at an event he was attending in New York, and kind of headed out to Walla Walla to check it out after having a Walla Walla Syrah that kind of reminded him of this old world style kind of Rhone region. So came out, checked it out, talked with a kind of godfather of Walla Walla wine, learned how to make wine, and kind of went back to New York thinking winemaking would be sort of a retirement project, but got the itch and sold a 600 square foot apartment in Manhattan that essentially got him a 20-acre vineyard in Walla Walla. So our first vintage was in 2005. It's our take with wine. It's very kind of European influence. We're very minimalistic as far as intervening with the winemaking process. So all of our ferments, they're all native ferments. We're not inoculating anything, or we're very kind of hands off and kind of let the fermentations and the aging process take place. So our love is our Rhone varietals, and Syrah in particular. So we do 6 different Syrahs a year, really kind of keeping that barrel program and age and fermentation process is like our controlled variable, because Washington and Walla Walla specifically, there's so many different soil types and climates within the valley and Washington State in general. So we really like to highlight each of those different unique terroirs, so to speak. So all of our wines are going to be very terroir and fruit focused. And being that low intervention, we really keep the focus on the land and the fruit itself. We've been in London and the UK for quite some time. We've been with Flint Wines. They're a great team that really advocate for Gramercy over here, so it's been a great kind of relationship in that sense. Sam and Gerard and his team, just flawless, great people. It's unfortunate we weren't able to come out this March for their Grand Portfolio tasting, but hope to be back soon next year, because that's always a great event.
I posed you the most difficult question you can ever pose somebody from a winery, which was to choose one of the wines that you're showing here today at your trade fair, and to just really give us a snapshot of that. And I guess potentially starting off with, why was it this particular wine that you chose to talk about today?
Yeah, so this is our 2018 John Lewis Syrah. This is what we consider to be our reserve Syrah. So Greg and Brandon Moss, the co-winemaker, they go through and blindly taste through all the Syrah barrels and kind of hand pick the top few barrels, kind of cellar select, and the top few go into this small case production. This year it tends up to be Block 46 from the Lake Colleen Vineyard in Walla Walla Valley. It's a premier Syrah site. This extends up into the foothills of the Blue Mountains. The Blue Mountains kind of surround the Walla Walla Valley. The soil type up there is this less windblown sediment, so it's this great soil type for Syrah. It kind of has great aromatics. You get nice floral notes, bright red fruits, and some great pepper to it. This wine's going to lay down and age quite nicely. We kind of harvest our fruit a little earlier than most, and we like these wines to be a little more acid-driven and a little bit lower in alcohol, so it's going to really pair nicely with food, but also going to cellar quite well. So, but this Syrah, it's been home here in the UK, so it's kind of familiar to the market, but it's also kind of the best of the best from our cellar. So that's kind of why I wanted to share with everyone. It's 100% Syrah, for the most part, all neutral, aged in neutral French barrels. We've got one new punch in on there just for a little bit of texture, but big into including the stems with our fermentation. So about 100% whole cluster fermented in concrete tanks. The stems add really great kind of tannin structure, nice savory complexity. So Greg and Brandon will be sampling the rows during harvest, and they'll actually separate the fruit, chew on the stems, and really kind of dial it in and see how much whole cluster they really want to use. But incorporating the stems is a big part of Gramercy in our winemaking technique. So it's a great representation of Walla Walla too. It's the Walla Walla Valley. It's always been based off agriculture. It's just within the last 35, 40 years, it evolved into now a kind of wine growing region. So what were more wheat fields are now slowly turning into more vineyards. So, but it's always been, the valley's always been birthed off agriculture, and the Missoula floods from the Ice Age really brought down this great sediment and soil type, and that's what makes the hot days, cool nights, and great soil makes for a really great wine growing region. Latitude-wise, we're almost on point with Bordeaux, so very similar kind of growing seasons. Looking forward to most representing Washington State and the Walla Walla Valley in particular, and kind of sharing our wines on the broader scale and bring it over to the UK. It's exciting to be a part, and the Washington State Wine Commission does a phenomenal job of kind of organizing these events, and it's really just kind of represent overall Washington State as a whole, and it's just a bonus to be pouring our wines, but overall just support Washington State and the Walla Walla Valley.
I'm Mark McNeilly from Mark Ryan Winery. I founded Mark Ryan in Washington State back in 1999. I really focus on the wines of Red Mountain. So Red Mountain's in southeastern Washington, just outside the Tri-Cities, and I'm sure everybody knows where the Tri-Cities are back home. But I'm really focusing on a lot of Cabernet-based wines. Our flagship wine's called Dead Horse. It's our Red Mountain Cabernet Sauvignon that I've been making for 22 years now. Its Merlot counterpart is called Long Haul. Delicious wines. Right now we're drinking a wine called the Dissident, which is maybe the entry level for Mark Ryan. It's a Cabernet-based blend with Merlot, Cab Franc, and Petit Verdot to support the Cabernet Sauvignon. So in Washington State, we're kind of a dynamic state. We have the Cascade Mountains that split our state from the north to the south. On the west side of the mountains is one of the last temperate rainforests in the world, and on the east side of the state is a high desert, and this is where we grow all our world-class grapes to make our great wines. Where we grow our grapes in Red Mountain is the primary location where we grow our grapes. We also get fruit from the Horseheaven Hills and the Columbia Valley and the Yakima Valley. So eastern Washington's a big territory, but we're starting to break it down into smaller regions and sub-regions. We make all the wine in Walla Walla, Washington, so in the very southeastern corner of the state. I run the business out of Woodinville, Washington, which is a little bit closer to Seattle on the west side of the mountains. So we are here in London. We're in East London, actually, and we're really looking to expand our kind of international wine sales, and we really think London's a great place to do it. There seems to be some demand for the style of wines that we make in Washington. And if I'm speaking about the style of Washington as well as Mark Ryan wines, I really think we have the ability to walk the line between kind of the fruit of New World wines with the terroir of the Old World wines. And I think that resonates with a lot of European wine drinkers. Today I'm going to mention a couple of wines, the first being Mark Ryan, the Dissident. Today we've got the 2019 vintage of this Columbia Valley red wine. This is 58% Cabernet Sauvignon, 38% Merlot, 6% Cab Franc, and 1% Petit Verdot. And if that equals 100%, then I'm on track. This really represents not only the style of Mark Ryan, but I think a great snapshot of Washington State. We pull fruit from the Horse Heaven Hills, Yakima Valley, and Red Mountain, so kind of three of our most important growing areas. All the wine is hand-picked, fermented in small lot fermentation, and aged in all French oak barrels. The majority of those are new. I think you really keyed on something, the freshness in these wines. The acidity is very fresh and present, and I think partly that comes from the diurnal shift that we have. So the very cool temperatures in the evening compared to the warm temperatures of the daytime. So that really helps keep acidity and fresh acidity in the wine. This wine does very well in the national press. The Wine Spectator named it wine number 46 of their top 100 for the 2016 vintage. We were very proud of that. And the Dissident is obviously a great Pearl Jam song as well. So sometimes I name some of my wines after my favorite bands and they're my favorite songs. So we have another label called Board Track Racer. It's not our second label. We call it our other label. The price points are a little bit lower. I base these labels on vintage motorcycles, which I enjoy back home. And we have a wine called Board Track Cabernet, which is about 75% Cab, and the balance is Merlot and Cab Franc. It's a great price point. It's a great style, very fruit forward, very delicious wine. Well, really being back from not traveling for the last couple of years like everybody else, I'm just getting a rush out of meeting people again and seeing people out and about and really sharing the Washington story with sometimes a new customer base. So people that have never had Washington wines before, I think, are surprised by just their approachability, also their ageability, and I think our price-value quotient is very high.
Thank you so much to you, Drew and Mark, for a really great way to kick off the day. As you can hear, there's something quite special about speaking with the winery representatives and getting that passion from them firsthand. That being said, the tasting also offered attendees the chance to attend masterclasses hosted by Jamie Goode. And we sit in on one of those masterclasses now, where Jamie introduces us to the region and covers, among other topics, the grape varieties most planted in Washington and the styles of wine that they create, the geological history of the region and the soils that it left behind, and shares some interesting examples of vineyards and growing sites that really represent this diversity.
We're going to start by just an overview of what makes Washington State a good place to grow wine grapes. And the focus of this talk is on blends. And so the first masterclass, we looked at the core varieties. So there's Washington State excels with Riesling, unusually for a region, in the New World to have a focus on Riesling. It's kind of unusual, but they do their Riesling really well. Chardonnay, well, lots of places do Chardonnay well, but it's a key variety here as well. And in the reds, Cabernet Sauvignon, which is by far the most widely planted grape, and also Syrah. But here we're going to be looking at one of the strengths of the region, which is blends. And that's largely been led by, I guess, the Bordeaux model, and so there's quite a bit of Merlot there as well as Cabernet Sauvignon. So that's the kind of core of a lot of Washington State's top wines, bring together the red Bordeaux varieties, but also the first wine here, we've got a blend of white varieties too. But before we get to the wines, let's look at the region. And this is quite a recent region. So the first grapes went in the ground in 1960. The first large producer, Associated Vintners, which later became Chateau San Michel, was established in 62. Saint Michel was established in 67. And then the first AVA, which is the term American Viticultural Area, it's like an AOP or AOC, that was established in 83, and that was Yakima Valley. Current situation is that there are over 1,000 registered wineries. That doesn't mean there are 1,000 separate individual wineries because of the way the law works. You know, you might have one winery with a number of different licensed wineries operating within it, but there's a lot of wineries, put it that way, and a lot of them are quite small. There are 400 growers, and in terms of vineyard area under vine, 60,000 acres, which turns into, I think it's about 24,000 hectares is the equivalent there. You can do the maths. So it's a reasonable size. By comparison, I guess you'd say it's the same size as Marlborough in New Zealand. Marlborough's about 28,000 hectares now. So it's a similar size to Marlborough in New Zealand. The area under vine's grown from just over 11,000 acres to 60,000. So you can see there's been more or less a steady growth in the region, which is, it is tailing off it's plateauing a little bit, but it's still growing. So this is a sizable wine region. Cabernet Sauvignon, 50,000 tonnes. This is the harvest in 21, so it's the most recent harvest. So Cabernet Sauvignon's dominant. Then the second most widely planted Chardonnay, Riesling, 22,000, Merlot, 21,000, Syrah, 20,000. And I think for me personally, the most exciting for me, I love Syrah. I think Syrah from Washington State is doing some awesome things. And there's some really good examples out here worth trying. But we're talking about blends. Growing regions, well, if you look at the map there, a few things to point out. First of all, you'll see that Olympic Peninsula sticking out there. And then you'll see up there, that's Vancouver Island, that's Canada, just above. So it's really close to Canada. And you'll see Vancouver Island is actually, Victoria and Vancouver Island is actually closer to Seattle than it is to Vancouver. And so if you know this area at all, you know it's green, lush, lots of rain. By the time you get over the Cascade Mountains, you've got pretty much a semi-arid desert. And that's where most of the wine grapes are grown. That's the Columbia Valley. So this red here is all Columbia Valley. And Seattle is just out there on the other side of the Cascades. And if you go to the region, if you go to Seattle, there's a place near Seattle called Woodinville, and there's lots of wineries have their base in Woodinville. And but the grapes all come from over the other side of the Cascade Mountains, which is because of this rain shadow effect, which this is a picture of a typical vineyard. You'll see, so the vines are green, they're irrigated, and everything else is quite dry in the middle of the summer. There we have the Pacific. There we have the Olympic Peninsula, the Olympics. So rainfall there is 3,500 millimetres. By way of comparison, London's around 750, Manchester's just over 1,000. And so that's a lot of rain. So the Olympics get an awful lot of rain. Then when you hop over the Olympics, you've got Seattle. Seattle's pretty damp as well. Seattle gets 1,000 millimetres a year, so just a metre of rain. And then the Cascades they're a kind of second rain shadow there. And then by the time you get to wine country, we're talking 150 to 200 millimetres of rain a year. So now to dry grow vines, as a rough ballpark, and it depends on lots of things, you need around 500 millimetres. So Central Otago, they get about 500, and you can dry grow there, but obviously a lot of people irrigate. It just depends on the evapotranspirative rate, the temperatures, how much wind there is, and also the soil water holding capacity. But generally speaking, you need around 500, and certainly with 200, you can't dry grow vines. So the fact that you've got this huge river, which is the fourth biggest in the USA, running through the region, means that there's plenty of water available. And that's what allowed the establishment in the 1960s onwards for these vineyards, was the fact that there was water available for irrigation. And there are bits where it is a bit damper, like the Columbia Gorge, which is down near the Oregon border. It gets a bit greener and damper there, and certainly you can dry grow vines there. But everywhere else, you need to irrigate. Looking at growing degree days. So this is an imperfect metric for how warm the region is, showing that you've got Burgundy there, but then you've got the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Then you climb a bit more to 2,500 and you've got Bordeaux. And so by way of comparison, 3 of the AVAs from Washington State, so Yakima Valley, Walla Walla, and Horse Heaven Hills, those three are sandwiched somewhere between Bordeaux and the Barossa Valley. And then you've got Oakville and Napa Valley there, and that's just a little bit more than Horse Heaven Hills. Then we've got Red Mountain, which is one of the AVAs in Washington State. Red Mountain is quite a famous AVA. There's some good examples of Red Mountain out there, actually, in the tasting. And then we go to St. Helena, another place in Napa Valley, and Chianti Classico, and finally Lodi, which is really hot. And I'm thinking Barossa probably belongs closer to Lodi than anything else there. But that just gives you an idea that there's plenty of warmth here. So it's a warm region. And this is really an interesting figure, because what that shows is the mean temperature across three different wine regions, Columbia Valley, Bordeaux, and Napa Valley. And it shows the mean temperature in July, August, September, and October. And why is this significant? Because by the time you get to September and October, we're entering the ripening season. And what we need at the ripening season, in an ideal world, is you want autumnal conditions. You want the summer to be over and the final stages of ripening to be taking place under nice, cool, moderate conditions. Because what's happening there is you're giving yourself a bigger picking window because maturity slows, but also you're giving the grapes a chance to reach what we call phenolic or physiological maturity. So this is flavour ripeness at modest sugar levels. Because what happens is if your ripening takes place in summer conditions, often the sugar just starts motoring, it keeps accumulating rapidly, and you're waiting for that flavour ripeness, for the skins to be ripe, for your tannins to be in the right place, while the sugars are just rocketing up. And then you pick the grapes and you end up with 16% alcohol, and it's that's not what we want, really. So you'll see that the Columbia Valley, by the time it gets to October, it's positively cool, and it's significantly cooler than Bordeaux and Napa. And during the months of July and August, it's warm. It's warmer than Bordeaux and Napa. But then in late September, early October, when harvest is taking place, typically, you've got nice cool conditions. And the other thing to note is the diurnal range. And you all know this stuff. So if you've got a nice hot day and then you've got a cool night, obviously photosynthesis only takes place during the hours of light and when temperatures are above 10 degrees centigrade. But in the night, you've got respiration taking place. So you have warm nights, and the vines towards harvest can be busy motoring through all those acids, respiring the acidity. And so the wisdom is that what happens is that as with a big diurnal range, grapes mature, but they preserve its acidity. So there's a freshness there, a natural acidity. And that's one of the attributes, I think, of a lot of Washington State wines, is that the natural acidity is present even whilst the grapes are quite ripe. Some geological features to talk about. Now, you could spend a long time talking about the geology of Washington State because it's quite interesting. There's a lot of interesting things that have happened. The first thing to note is lava flows, and those are columns of lava that have, that looks kind of volcanic, doesn't it? So the base soil type across most of Washington State is basalt, so that's been laid down by ancient volcanoes. Then on top of that, a lot of the soils that you have in Washington State didn't actually come from Washington State. They came from Montana and Idaho, because what happened is that there was a series of flood events, which we'll talk about in a second, that brought a lot of what is now currently the soil in the Columbia Valley from other states and deposited it there. So you've got effectively, depending on where you are, you'll have a basaltic base covered by quite deep stuff that's come from floods. So a very interesting soil type here is the loess, which is like a sandy, we'll look at this later as well. It's a sort of sandy-like material that's been deposited by floods. It was suspended in the water, and then when the floods stop moving, all the stuff that's suspended in the water just sinks to the bottom, and that's become the soil type. And then it gets blown around as well. You've heard of wind-blown loess. There's a lot of that around here. So the long and short of it is that most of the vineyard soils here are free draining and nutrient poor. Free draining is good because vines do like free draining soils, and when you've got irrigation there, you can actually use that as a tool to manipulate wine style and quality because the soils are quite free draining. And they're nutrient poor, which would be really bad for growing corn and broadacre farming. But for vines don't mind it, actually. So these soils are quite good vineyard soils. That's the long and short of it. So underneath everything else, you've got the basaltic soils. And in some parts of the Columbia Valley, you get the basalt quite near the surface, and it comes into play for the vines then. In most places, it's buried under quite a lot of other stuff. So back about 50,000 years ago, this huge glacial lake Missoula was sitting there, and there's an ice dam. So it's held in by one end by an ice dam. And over a repeated series of events, the ice dam broke and then reformed. So when the ice dam breaks, glacial Lake Missoula, which is huge, sends floodwaters all the way across Washington State, all the way to the Pacific. And it even went down as far as Oregon. And the thing about these floods is that they were kind of pretty extreme. So the waves would have been about 120 meters high, running at 60 miles an hour. So if you were in the way of that, it would be pretty unpleasant. Also, a mass of water that big can take a lot of material with it. And that's what happened. So these happened over about 50,000 years ago, and a number of cycles of flooding and everything meant that lots of soils that are presently in the vineyard areas there were deposited. There's a special place here called the Warlord Gap. And what this gap is, it's quite a narrow gap. And so when you've got all that water coming along and only a narrow gap, everything backs up. And as the water loses speed, then all the stuff that it contains starts depositing. So below a certain height, everything was covered by these slack water deposits, they're called. So the stuff that was moved by the water suddenly ended up on the floor. And so that's the basis of the soil. So the volcanic stuff, millions of years ago, and then 15,000 and 13,000 years ago. That's what they've calculated when all this happened. So it was a 2,000-year period, and the period of the cycle of flooding and reformation of the Missoula Lake lasted an average of 55 years. So it took 55 years for the ice dam to disappear, flooding, and then the ice dam builds up again, and the lake builds up again. And so this cycle is quite dramatic. So soils. So this is loess here, and it's like a sandy, dusty stuff, and it looks quite poor. It doesn't have a high degree of organic material in it, and it just blows around with the wind. So it's moved around quite a bit. So that's one of the predominant soil types. The Cole 41 have got a vineyard called Ferguson. This is in Walla Walla. So what you'll see there is those basaltic soils, very dramatic. They look fantastic. That's what these vines are growing in. So that's higher up, so it never got covered over by all these slack water deposits that were carried by the floods. And so it'll be interesting when you taste that, because I think it's got a distinctive character to it that you could attribute to the soils. And this is another famous vineyard in Walla Walla, and it's called the Rocks of Milton Freedwater. And if you look at that, it looks like Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It's got these pebble stones, alluvial deposits, pebble stones like that. That's actually Caillou's, their vineyard. But there's this small AVA, it's quite a recently created one, called the Rocks of Milton Freedwater. And the wines from here have a very distinctive flavour. And most famously, Syrah is grown here, but this wine that we've got here is a blend of Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon. And although it's got mostly Cabernet Sauvignon in it, it tastes more of the place, I think, than it does of Cabernet Sauvignon. And one of the things that we like about Washington State wines is, this is a nice way of phrasing it, new world fruit with old world structure and acidity. And I guess new and old world classifications, it's a kind of a lazy way of talking about things in some ways, but I think it can be useful as well. And that's what I think these wines managed to capture, which is this kind of the halfway house between overt fruit and generosity, but also then structure and acidity.
As mentioned in the intro, you can find below details of all the wines tasted in Jamie's 2 masterclasses hosted on the day. These were the core varieties in Washington State, an intro to 4 of the most widely planted varieties. And in the other session, Jamie covered Washington State blends and the impressive results that are being achieved in the state. As you can probably hear, it was super busy on the day, with over 170 trade professionals attending, tasting more than 90 wines from 21 different brands. And I took the opportunity to catch up with a couple of the trade attendees. First, Amy Bajent of Majestic Wines, who is also in the process of setting up Arrow Wines to highlight exciting wine regions like Washington. And I also sat down with former Interpreting Wine guest Dan Belmont of goodwinegoodpeople.com.
My name's Amy. I am a senior assistant store manager at Majestic Wine. My connection to Washington wine has been actually initially started with having a huge love of the NFL and loving the Seattle Seahawks. So 10 years supporting the Seattle Seahawks. And I was visiting some friends over in Washington and went to Woodinville, which is an area where there are, I think it's 130, but it might have increased now, tastings in a 3-mile radius, which means you really get to explore completely different styles, go to like 5 tasting rooms in a day and kind of really explore what Washington has to offer. So prior to COVID, obviously when everyone could travel, I would go out there about twice a year. And on my last trip, actually managed to go to Eastern Washington and go and visit where the wine is actually produced, which was a really nice experience there. I don't think there was a winery that I visited that didn't have a stunning tasting room, and they're so knowledgeable and they're so passionate about their wine. And my main thing has been I've been trying to educate people over here and saying how amazing the wine is, because in the UK everyone knows about Napa and some people know about Oregon, but no one really has even heard that Washington even does wine. And my passion over in this country has been trying to explain to people English sparkling. So I'm very much not the underdog necessarily, but trying to educate people on wines that they might not necessarily have heard of, but explaining just how amazing they can be and how we're looking at wines that are, especially in Washington, that are on the same latitude as Bordeaux. So you're getting these kind of Bordeaux blends, but they're much higher alcohol. They can be a lot more creative with their wines, just purely because they don't have the regulations and things that Bordeaux has. So it means that I've been to wineries and tasting rooms in Washington that some are more Spanish style. You've got Tuscan styles, you've got Bordeaux blends, Rhone blends. It's just, they can be so expressive and completely different. And that is what I'm really trying to educate people. And when I saw that this tasting was coming up today, I was like, I have to go, because some of these wineries I didn't even get a chance to taste. There's so many out there. Even in 4 trips I haven't tasted all 130 tasting rooms. I'd probably come off like an alcoholic if I had tasted all 130 tasting rooms.
Exactly, no judgment.
If someone hasn't ever tried Washington wine, I think there is the perfect reason to, is purely because they can be so expressive. The winemaker can really almost show their art form in the wine, more so than old world wines, which have, as I mentioned, the regulations that they do. And it's just, every winery is so different, and they really do. They try and express the Washington terroir, but also their own personal take on it. So a Tuscan style or southern Spain and things like this. And it's just so interesting and exciting. There's not many wine regions that I know of or have had a chance to explore that are trying to show off what Washington can offer, but also take on that kind of old world wine. No, I would love to see Washington wine more in the UK, and things like this are fantastic to promote Washington wine. 3 words: exciting, unique, and I would say beautiful, because it is the artist, the winemaker has put that time and effort to explore and produce something that is, for me, out of this world. It's something else, and I'm hugely passionate about Washington wine, and no, I'm pleased we're finally getting the tastings over here.
Amazing.
Hey, my name is Dan Belmont. I am the proprietor of goodwinegoodpeople.com. I am an American expat that lives here in London. I've been here for 6 years now, and still have very strong connections to the American wine scene. Washington State has always been of interest to me. It feels a bit like the wild, wild west of wine. You know, they're a West Coast, but they're not coastal. They're not cool climate like Oregon. They're not California. There's something all unique to themselves, and they're making really exciting wines. Washington State wines, they have a savory quality to them, and they have really wonderful drinkability. The red wines, they are robust, they're muscular, they're powerful. And then the white wines are just really drinkable, approachable. There's acidity there, there's freshness, and they're working with, just really kind of approachable styles that really anybody can get behind. So part of my business is sharing wines that people have otherwise not been familiar with, and I never hesitate to share something from Washington State. I've never gotten feedback that would suggest that this wine is not ready to go, and really a crowd-pleasing experience. Washington State wines, 3 words, it's tough. They're alive, all right? They make you feel alive. I think they have structure, right? And you feel that presence. And they've got terroir, too, and they've got a sense of place. So it's way more than 3 words.
A huge thank you to Amy and Dan for taking the time away from the tasting to share your passion of Washington wine. And I think the points that you raised there really are consistent with those raised by Jamie in his earlier masterclass. We round off this episode in the company of 2 more winery representatives who were present on the day. First, I sat down with Jana Rinker of DeLille Cellars before closing with Craig Mitchell of Chateau San Michel.
My name is Jana Rinker, and I am the sales director at DeLille Cellars, based out of Woodinville, Washington, which is about 30 miles north of Seattle. Of course, it's in western Washington. Our vineyards are mostly focused on Red Mountain, which is one of the smaller and warmer AVAs in Washington State, and really focused on Bordeaux varietals. The winery was founded in 1992. And so we were the 50th bond in the state. Now there are well over 1,000 wineries. And the winery was founded on making Bordeaux blends. And it's still today what makes up the bulk of our production, although we do other wines. We have a large wine club, large following, especially in the Pacific Northwest. And we make quite a few wines that you might not see in the trade that are for our tasting room only, for our wine club. Mm-hmm. Red Mountain is unique, and it's where the founders started with, because they were actually working with Dick Boucher and Jim Holmes well prior to starting DeLille, selling wines to home winemakers in the late 80s. And so when they decided to make their own wines, they of course had an in with some of the best growers in the state. And so the first wine they made was Schiller Estate, and that was a Cabernet-focused red blend. And then they followed quickly thereafter with D2, which is our Merlot-focused red blend. And we also make, they said, well, every great chateau has a Blanc, and so they decided to make Schiller Blanc. It was called Schiller Estate Blanc originally. And so those still today are our core 3 wines. We make a few other wines. We're just starting a new project called Métier, which means craft or trade, and that's going to be a little bit more accessible price point wise, a little bit more released a little bit sooner, more drinkable in its youth. That's the idea there. We are not currently in the UK for distribution, but we're looking. We want to find the right partner, so we're excited to be here and be able to hopefully meet some people today. So the wine that we're tasting today, this is called Schiller Blanc. So as I mentioned, it was the first white wine we made at DeLille, starting in 1994. It is still made the same way. This is a Sauvignon Blanc Semillon blend that's fermented with whole clusters. And then it spends 6 months, actually it's fermented in barrel, and it is hand stirred in those barrels for 6 months before bottling. It actually takes 1 cellar hand a day and a half during those 6 months each week to stir the barrels. So it's quite a labor-intensive way of making white wine, especially Sauvignon Blanc. It's sort of unheard of for the New World, but I think the result is in the wine. It's just an incredibly rich wine. Pairs with all sorts of foods. However, the finish is really bright and fresh, and makes it super drinkable in its youth as well. I've had actually a 2009 vintage of this quite recently, and it was incredible. Still had lots of youth to it. So the wine also can age in your cellar quite well. Foods I would take with this would be definitely roast chicken, scallops, any sort of seafood, sea bass, any sort of rich white fish would be great. But at the winery, we refer to this wine as Blanc. It's everybody's favorite white wine, and we just drink it on its own at happy hour too. So it's definitely a very versatile white wine. I think sometimes when you think about Sauvignon Blanc Semillon, it has the depth of the weight of a Chardonnay, but it's got the freshness, a little bit of that lemon curd too.
Yeah.
It's really, and stone fruit. It's a really beautiful white wine.
Really cool.
Yeah, and I know Washington is, mostly known for reds, but again, I think this wine, it stood the test of time, and it's still everybody's favorite at the winery, and it's just a beautiful example of what white wine can be in Washington State. Another note to say is that the vineyards we're working with here, there are 2 of them from Red Mountain that are actually some of the oldest Sauvignon Blanc vineyards in the state. Ciel de Cheval and Clipson, and we're also sourcing from Sagemore, which is owned by Duc Boucher. We've been working with him for a long time, and again, old plantings of vineyards too. So only 3 vineyards in this blend, which is also pretty interesting.
So I'm Craig Mitchell. I'm the Regional Director for San Michel Wine Estates, based here in the UK and covering the UK, Ireland and the Nordic countries. We are the largest wine company in Washington State. With Chateau San Michel, we're the founding winery of Washington State. We can trace our history back to the 1930s. However, really, Chateau San Michel began as it's known today in 1967, when we called ourselves Chateau San Michel. We have 2 wineries, one in Woodinville, just outside of Seattle, the other in Canoe Ridge in the Horsehaven Hills. In Woodinville, we produce all of our white wines. We produce our red wines over the other side of the Cascade Mountains at the Canoe Ridge estate. Yeah, we've, like I say, been producing for over 50 years, which means in American terms we're fairly ancient. And for a lot of people, the name Chateau San Michel is synonymous with Washington State. As I say, it's the largest and the most awarded. And we produce wine from all over the state. The wine that we have in front of us just now is a great example of what we do. This comes from our Columbia Valley range. And that's the range really where we are trying to, it's our calling card if you like. We're trying to introduce people to our wines. These wines have the widest audience, the most dedicated consumers, and they've been drunk by generations of people in America. So the grapes are picked from all over the Columbia Valley, from the many AVAs. And I guess it's probably one of the hardest wines for a winemaker to make. He has the most decisions to make in terms of selection. He needs to get it absolutely right year after year, and to produce to a fairly consistent style with some evolution, obviously, as consumer demands change. The beauty of this wine, for me, is fully ripe, pure fruit-driven Cabernet Sauvignon, with an alcohol, a gentle alcohol for New World wine, about 13.5%, which makes it incredibly drinkable. It's very aromatic on the nose, very sappy, juicy, bursting with fruit. And then on the palate, it's got beautifully integrated, soft, powdery tannins, and it's just a joy to drink. We always compare it with a wine in the old world, if you like. If you think of Bordeaux, obviously producing Cabernet, Bordeaux AC is the widest, appellation. It's the same for this wine. However, we like to think that what you get from Washington State, speaks to you much more of the state. It's much more purity of fruit, consistent over vintages, etc. Obviously, it reflects the terroir in which it's grown. It's very dry in Washington State. Someone told me recently that there's 300 days of sunshine. Obviously, I'm a Scotsman, so that was fairly novel for me. But it's 300 days of sunshine and small amount of rain every year. Eastern Washington, So we use drip irrigation to really maximise vine growth and get exactly what we want. This wine's fairly available in the UK, both in the on and the off trade, and it does really well for us. It's very well awarded and regularly features in magazines and judgments, etc. So, as a result, it's very popular, and it's a key varietal. Obviously, Cabernet is the biggest red variety, Cabernet being king, and we like to think this is the benchmark for the States. In terms of UK availability of our wines are quite available for Washington. Until fairly recently, there was no Washington in the UK, and in fact, one of the leading retailers had all the countries in the world mapped out, and then they had California, which was a little bit strange. So I saw it as a great opportunity to introduce the US and to beat the drum for Washington, and we've been doing that for a number of years now with some success. So you can find our wines and other wines of Washington too now in Majestic, soon to be some of them in Tesco, and some of them might come into Asda as well. So, they're starting to come into mainstream distribution rather than, where they were initially successful, which was with the on-trade and the independents, where people have the time to talk about Washington, what makes it special, etc. So that's kind of caught fire a little bit, if you like, and that's why it's, the interest has peaked amongst some of the bigger grocers, and we're now going to see some Washington wines on the shelf there, which is great. But I would think Washington Chardonnay, Riesling, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, which for me are the key varieties, are usually you're going to be able to find them within the UK. I mean, Washington State is like no other in terms of producing wine. For people who have travelled to other places around the world, forget everything you've seen before, because Washington is vastly different. It's huge, wide, open country, and the vines are grown throughout the Columbia Valley in little irrigation spots. It really is the perfect climate for growing wine. It's very warm in the growing season and cool at night. And there's very little rain, so there's very little disease pressure. The wines are usually fairly naturally grown. And obviously the key for me for Washington is because of its northerly latitude, we're able to produce beautifully ripe wines with high acidity, which makes us different from California, for example, and even Oregon. So definitely try Washington wine. The wines are extremely good value for money, which also sets them apart. And I think once you've tried them once, you try them again and again and again.
Once again, a huge thank you to all of my guests on today's very special episode. While the podcast can't quite do justice to being there in person and tasting along with the winery representatives, I hope that it's given you a sense of what it was like to be there on the day. And I think through the voices of those there, really captured the excitement that currently exists around Washington State wines. Do see below for an extended list of all of today's guests. And for the wineries covered, I've also included details of the wines tasted and also whether or not the wineries are represented in the UK. Do be sure to check out the Washington State Wine Commission online. And I've also left details of the Washington State 101 presentation, where you can find the graphics covered by Jamie in his presentation. That brings the Washington State Wine This Is Now series to a close, and I'd just like to extend a special thank you to the Washington State Wine Commission for inviting me and my listeners to revisit this region once again. If you're not already, please do subscribe wherever you're listening to be alerted when the next series goes live. And of course, I'd love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.